On day 2 of the FIDE Candidates, some amazing games were played, and in this video I'm going to bring you the highlights of the game between the two Indian youngsters. Praggnanandhaa playing with the white pieces against his fellow countryman Gukesh, only 18 and 17 years old, and these two are already playing at this highest possible stage. They are fighting for the world title. Only the winner of this candidates tournament qualifies, has the right to challenge the world champion Ding Liren in a match later this year. So that means the players, all these 8 players in this event, they are trying their best. They are taking a lot of risks, and we can see it also in this game. Some incredible things are happening already in the opening. So let's see what happens. You have to do only one thing. Well, let's do 2 things. Watch this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for doing that. I will show you what happened. Praggnanandhaa opens the game here with the move 1d4. d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, g3. We have the Catalan opening. And here Gukesh played the move bishop to b4 check. It's considered to be a very solid and reliable system. White usually plays here the solid move bishop to d2, or the more ambitious move knight bd2. But also this move, knight c3. Very interesting idea, but less common. It's a move I've played myself in the past. After d takes c4, bishop to g2, castling kingside. So does white, knight c6. It's the best way of challenging white's position. With a knight on c6, it's harder for white to move the knight away at some point. Now the pawn on d4 is attacked, still defended of course, but knight c6 is the main move. And here, a modern twist is the move a3, questioning the bishop on b4. Now, if you do take on c3, you're helping white to strengthen the center. Now the knight may come to d2 later, or first you bring the bishop out to g5, maybe e4 is there. Looks like white is a bit better here. But bishop e7 back. It's a modest move, but the bishop is a good piece. And white still has some difficulties to regain the pawn. If you ever move the queen, let's say you go queen a4 for instance, then the knight can take the pawn on d4. So white has a different plan. He's not interested in regaining the pawn, but is aiming for ways to obtain full compensation for the pawn. Dynamical play in the center with the move e4. Look at these pawns. Black plays here the move a6, so that after bishop to e3, the pawn goes to b5. So just to make sure that white can never win back that pawn on c4. White is going to develop its position, moves the queen to e2. The bishop goes to b7. And white plays here the move rook a1. So as I said, white is having nice compensation, practical compensation, having 2 pawns in the center, but a pawn is a pawn. And whether it's enough, we will find out very soon. Black play the move knight a5. The knight can sometimes come to b3, but more importantly, you're opening up the diagonal for the bishop. So you're hitting the pawn on e4. And how to deal with that? Well, in a number of games, white played here the move knight e5 to defend the pawn now with the bishop is a reasonable option. But interesting here is the way Praggnanandhaa is playing here. He played the move d5. It's a very typical strike in the center. So you're hoping to open up the d file for your rook, challenging the queen on d8. Black has no choice, but has to capture the pawn on d5. By far the best move. And now, rather than taking back on d5, which doesn't really accomplish anything, white goes for this move, e5. Very, very spectacular idea. It's pretty well known in a lot of Catalan type of structures to sacrifice these pawns, advance your pawn to e5, attacking the knight. And well, in a number of positions, black would even consider moves like c6. And after e takes f6, bishop takes f6, you have this interesting clash of 3 pawns against the piece. Very complex position, was not played in the game, but it's an idea you often get to see. Here, Gukesh plays a much better move. He goes for the move knight e8. Looks very passive, but there is no need to sacrifice the piece here. But look what Prag is doing. He has already sacrificed 2 pawns. And now you will think, okay, he's trying to win back some material, but no way. Instead, and that's a typical way of fighting for the initiative, you sacrifice even more material. And he does it here with the move e6. This comes as a huge surprise to everyone, including myself. I was watching this game live and thinking, what on earth is happening here? Why do you sacrifice this pawn? Where's the compensation? But it's a very complicated position here. And the good thing for Pragg is that he caught his opponent by surprise. Praggnanandhaa was about 1 hour up on the clock on this point, and up to this point he was mainly blitzing out his moves. He knew what he was doing, and probably his idea is that if black captures on e6, then you're moving the bishop away to open up the e-file, to hit the pawn on e6. There is a very good chance that you win back the pawn on e6 at some point, after which the pawn on d5 likely will drop as well. And there are other ideas, like you can go bishop h3, at some point the knight can come to e5, or maybe to g5 later, or to d4. So there's a lot of piece play, and what exactly was prepared by Pragg, I don't know. But what I know is that Gukesh didn't capture on e6, but instead he decided here to advance the pawn to f5, an absolute incredible idea. And this is the moment where, for the first time in the game, Praggnanandhaa also started to think, why is black ignoring this pawn? He believes that the pawn on e6 is not too dangerous. That could be the case, but it can also become quite an important attacking tool. Let's see how it works out. Here, knight e5 was played, and now you see the diagonal for the bishop has been opened, so white is exerting pressure against the pawn on d5 with a knight, bishop, and rook on d1. And if you protect the pawn one more time, there is knight d7, not only trapping the rook on f8, but you're preparing here this move bishop b6 with a double attack on the knight and the queen. So black's idea after knight e5 is to come back with a knight to f6. That's why the pawn was placed on this square. And here, white doesn't have an immediate way to break through. There are various options, but you also got to reckon with ideas for black, like queen d6 or maybe queen c8, trying to win back the pawn on e6. And well, difficult to say what is best. In a lot of cases, it does make sense to play something like rook e1 to indirectly defend, overprotect the pawn on e6, even if the pawn will be lost if the queen captures on e6 at some point. For instance, if you do play queen d6 now, I think knight d7 is a very interesting idea, tactical idea, to attack the rook, to threaten also bishop f4, and then you see there's a lot of pressure on the e and d file. I mean, black is probably still okay here, and queen d6 is not a forcing idea at all, not a forcing move. You may consider a move like c6 as well, but that's something which was not played in the game. Pragg had a different plan. He played here the move queen c2. So he is leaving the e-file and hits the pawn on f5, but not sure that is really important pawn, as your queen can also become vulnerable on the f-file, and it was probably better just to bring another piece into the attack. And now position is so incredibly complex, both sides are sharing inaccurate decisions with each other here. Instead of playing the move c5, which is just a very good move, with a point that if you do take on f5, then you march forward with your pawns. It's a very strong pawn duo. The knight on a5 defends the bishop, and black is in great shape. So there are some reasons why this was not played. Could be that maybe knight takes d5 was a bit of a problem for Gukesh. After knight takes d5, there is knight d7, so that the queen no longer defends the knight. White is threatening to win the knight on d5 and to take on f8, but there's knight takes e3. Intermediate move, attacking the queen, you can take back. Bishop takes, queen takes g2. Very spectacular position, but there are not too many threats here. Black is a piece up. White may take on f8, and then you can take back with the queen. You have two pieces, two minor pieces for the rook. Black seems to be all right after something like rook c8, intending to get the knight back into the game. So, all in all, c5, that's the way to go. But Gukesh played c6. He plays it in a more modest way, defending the pawn on d5. Now queen takes f5 is played, and at least for now, white doesn't have to be concerned about counter strikes in the center with the move d5, d4. Queen e8 is played, so the queen is trying to get out of the d-file. Still, I think something like rook e1 is kind of a useful move here. And also with the queen on e8, you no longer have to fear about knight f7 coming with tempo. But knight f7 was played here anyway, and this is also a very interesting moment, because how should black tackle this problem of your knight standing in your position? It dominates the queen and rook. It's very difficult to move, but you can always consider sacrificing the exchange by taking on f7, and it's complex position, but I believe in these pawns. It makes it really hard for white to use the rooks efficiently. The bishop may come back to c8, the rook can come into the game, the knight can come to b3. There's quite a lot of potential when these pawns are able to come forward, but for the moment it's not easy to do so. Anyway, rook takes f7 was not played, and Gukesh had a totally different plan. First he played a move bishop c8 to attack the pawn on e6. I mean, you always have rook takes f7 as a possibility. Rook fe1 was played now. Rook takes f7 with the idea that you cannot take back on f7. It's not really valid here, because the pawn on e6 will capture on e7, on f7 with check. So here there are still possibilities to play active with a move like a knight b3, especially if you're considering to take on f7 with the rook. It makes sense to have your knight there, so that you will try to get in active pawn moves later on, or the knight can come back to c5. But Gukesh doesn't want to sacrifice on f7. That's if he would have liked to do that, he would have done earlier. He played here the move knight to b7, which has some interesting points. For instance, the knight may come to d6 or even to c5, but there's also another idea. Bishop g5 played here, so that the rook now supports the pawn on e6 even better. And still, I think knight c5 is an excellent move. It's very tactical, very complicated. For instance, after bishop takes f6, you can take back perhaps, but there's also the possibility to take first on e6, intermediate move, attacking the queen. And black is all right. After an insane variation with knight h6, if you do take on h6, I guess that the idea here is to take on e6, and you do get a number of pieces. So that looks okay for white. But you can also go king h8 when the bishop is still pinned. Now after bishop takes check, king takes g7, rook takes e6. There are so many tactical lines. If you take on f5, knight takes f5 with check, hitting the bishop on e7 as well. But simpler is to take on e6, queen takes e6, and now move the bishop away. Insane position, but black is all right. There are not so many threats against the black king. However, this is impossible to calculate for humans. So therefore, I think we should forgive these players. Rook a7, it's not the best move in the position, but there's definitely some thought behind it. So the rook is now trying to get developed along the 7th rank without moving the bishop. The bishop stays there on c8 to put pressure against the pawn on e6. But look at this. Now, game becomes very tactical. Bishop takes f6. Black takes back. And now, after sacrificing already 3 pawns this game, now piece sacrifice. Bishop takes d5. C takes d5, knight takes d5. So the knight is incredibly active, intending to take on f6. And then there are even ideas that after g takes f6, the queen comes to the g file with checkmating ideas. Let's say you play a random move, then ideas to take here, and queen g4 is checkmate. So you got to do something about that threat. Even if you think now it's the time to take on e6, it's a huge blunder because it runs into knight takes f6. G takes f6 is met by intermediate move. Knight h6 check, king goes away, and only now you take on e6 with a devastating attack for white. The alternative, instead of taking back on f6, is to take with the king on f7. But now, brilliant shot is rook takes e6. Attacking the queen. If you take the rook, it's rook d7 check. The king can't go anywhere. Queen takes d7, knight takes d7, discover check, and on the next move the rook will be taken as well. So knight takes f6 is the huge threat. The bishop therefore went back to e7. And everything is still protected. But what should white do here? It's incredibly complex still, and players are getting lower on time. Also, Pragg was spending quite a bit of time after his 1 hour advantage on the clock. He was not much uptime anymore here around this point. He still have this option of playing knight h6, which is a check, and if you take on h6, there's queen g4, with the point that if you go to h8, there's queen d4, and the rook is hanging, and that looks pretty good for white. But you can also play the move bishop g5, block with your bishop the check, then queen d4 is still a good move, attacking your rook. No time to move the rook away because of e7. Look at this, now we see why these rooks are needed in the center. You hit the rook on f8, if you go rook f7, knight c7, attacking the queen. If queen goes away, you promote the pawn and you win the queen. But after queen d4, what black should do, and this was all not played in the game because white didn't sacrifice the knight on h6. Bishop takes e6, give back that rook on a7, with the point that after queen f7, black is in time to consolidate, threatening to take on d5, for instance. Also ideas to just play very actively. Still very complex position. Rook takes e6 is an option. You cannot take on f2 because the queen on a7 defends against the threat. But after queen takes e6, queen takes b7, this is a total mess still. I think black is all right. He can play queen e2, force the rook to go to f1. Also after knight h6, king h8 is a possibility, and then it's probably ending in a draw. But both players should be praised here for their fighting spirit. They're looking for getting the most out of this position. Pragg played here this move, queen to g4. So probably he's still looking for these sort of ideas with knight h6. Or probably there are some other ideas as well. It's not so easy to suggest a good move. For instance, if you play something like knight c5, I guess the idea is to play this check. Pawn on g7 is pinned, king h8, and then the knight can come to f5 with a mating threat on g7. Also, the bishop is hanging, so things are incredibly complex, and black is struggling to untangle because of that annoying pawn on e6. But now, finally, we get to understand Gukesh, his plan. What is this knight doing on b7? It could have gone to more active square like b3, but his plan is not to give up that rook from f8, but with the move knight e8, he is undermining the knight on f7, and that knight is going to be exchanged very soon. Now, even plans like queen d4 to hit the rook and prepare ideas like knight takes e7 followed by taking on d8 can be met by knight takes e6, attacking the queen. And if you take the rook and his rook takes f7, everything is pretty well covered. So black is having here two minor pieces against the rook, and that means that he's in good shape. Still very complex. I can imagine that you may think that white is having a lot of pressure here, but objectively these bishops, they are able to become really strong later on. So knight e8, let's see, knight takes d8 was played, and bishop takes back. So black is still a piece up, and even though these pieces are very passive on the back rank, white cannot make any progress. It's impossible to play e7 because the pawn is pinned. So queen goes to d4 to hit the rook, but the rook stays on the 7th rank. So that with the bishop and the queen, you're guarding the e7 square. So this knight on d5 doesn't have a good knight fork. e7 can just be met by bishop takes e7. That is absolutely all right. Instead, after rook b7, there followed the move rook to e4, trying to strengthen the pawn on e6. But bishop f6, attacking the queen. You don't want to take, because then black will eventually be able to win the pawn on e6. Queen e3 played, supporting the pawn, but the bishop goes back, and white doesn't have a single threat. White is running out of useful moves. There are no ideas to improve your rooks, for instance. The queen comes to c6. And after h5, bishop comes to c5 to hit the queen. The queen goes to g5. You may already take on f2, but even simpler is to eliminate that annoying pawn finally. h6 was played. There's not even a threat because the rook covers the 7th rank. And after rook takes f2, black wins the game. White resigned here because you're piece down. And if you get out of a potential discovered check, for instance. The rook comes to f5 to hit the queen, hit the knight. You can give a check on d8, but after bishop f8, everything is still hanging on this diagonal. And that means that Gukesh has a very important victory, his first win of the tournament. So he is in the shared lead. And for Pragg, this is a very painful loss. But only 2 rounds have been played, 12 more rounds to go. Anything can still happen. And I will cover all the action on the channel. So just make sure to subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And many more exciting games of this event are going to be covered on Robert Riss Chess channel. So thanks for doing that. Thanks for tuning in and see you soon. Bye bye.